everyone, welcome back. So you made it through chapter 1, and now we're going to talk about chapter 2, which really looks at the idea of evidence-based practice and the process that we use to evaluate it. So evidence-based practice is defined by Rubin and Babbie as the process in which practitioners make decisions in light of the best research evidence available. It's really important to know that we throw around the words like evidence-based practice a lot. Evidence-based practices or evidence-based practice, and the idea that as clinicians we're doing things that have evidence to back it up. But what's important to acknowledge is evidence-based practice doesn't suddenly give us this square block of things that we have to do. You're not going to have a client that comes in at 12 and you're going to be like, let me look through my mental library and immediately pick out this intervention and here's all the research about it, right? It's this process, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I love Rubin and Babbie because they do differentiate between the fact that there are evidence-based practices, so treatment modalities like EMDR, that have a lot of research behind them. But evidence-based practice as the verb, can also mean it is something that has research behind it, that you've put a lot of thought and that you've gone through this process. So a couple things to be aware of when we're looking at evidence-based practice that the book refers to is that it's applicable at all levels of social work. Often we use evidence-based practice in terms of things like treatment modalities, clinical social work, that kind of thing. But there are best practices with things like doing community needs assessments and engaging with community organization. And so evidence-based practice really needs to be at the heart of all levels of social work. The other thing that's important to understand is that it doesn't dictate what we do. You will never have a moment where you're like, oh, EMDR, here I'm going to go through my little checkbook guide. It's going to tell me exactly what to do. Now, there are curriculums that will give you a structure, they'll give you worksheets, they'll give you an idea. But really, when we're figuring out which practice to use, it's not going to be clear. They're not going to say, okay, input on a website, all the different characteristics of your client, boom, this is the one for them. And so as practitioners, we have to be consumers of this information using a process. Finally, I think it's important to note that evidence-based practice is a career-long process. So even if you have an area you get pretty confident and skilled in, things are always changing. And even now, as a professor, I still do 20 hours of CEUs a year, which are continuing education units. And I have to do that to maintain my license and because I want to be aware of the changes that are coming. So it's not like once you're done with school, you have them all accessible and you're ready to go. It's career long, and we're always learning and using this process to evaluate evidence-based practices for the field. So Rubin and Babbie have this model on page 26, and it's the transdisciplinary EBP model. And what I love about this model is it's the decision-making right in the middle. And above, you can see best available research evidence. It is really critical to be able to know what's out there, what's being talked about, what research modalities are currently being looked at. That's incredibly important. But there are other things that we have to be doing as well. One thing is client population characteristics, needs, values, and preferences. You have a lot of great models that have a very prescribed kind of structure, at least. It may not tell you what to do, but kind of an idea of the process. That may not work with your client. I have a great example. When I was doing therapy with adolescents, I used a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. I really enjoyed it. I loved it. And part of CBT is homework, that you give your clients homework, they fill it out, and then you come back and you discuss it. Well, I had a 14-year-old who was really struggling, and I said, okay, I'm going to give you some homework. And she looks at me, she goes, Hilary, she's like, I can barely get homework done for my teachers. Do you think I'm really going to do yours? I was like, at least she was honest. And so what we did is we adapted it. We took the homework, we worked on it through the different sessions we had together and talked about it. I integrated her mom so she could talk about what she was learning with her mom. So even though CBT said homework's a big part of it, it didn't work with my client's needs and her abilities. And so it's always something we're tug-of-warring with sometimes. Also, we have to look at things like resources. EMDR is a great training, but if your organization doesn't offer it and you do it privately, we're talking thousands of dollars to get certified. And so sometimes there's great curriculum, there's great worksheets, there's great screening tools, and they cost money. And so you may not have those resources. Also, your practitioner expertise as well. You may not have experience with a group compared to a different one. And finally, when you're making those decisions, you're looking at research, you're looking at your client, you're looking at your resources, and then you're looking at the larger environment organizational context. So with the evidence-based practice process, it really is a lot more complex than just 12-year-old girl, insert treatment modality here. It's really more of a guide for us than a strict process. So the book goes over the stages of the evidence-based practice process. And what you're going to see is when we go into chapters 3 and 4, there's a lot of similarities between this process and a research process that we're going to talk about. Now, it's important to note that these are very similar in some ways to the research and the literature review you're going to do. So take some good notes. So step 1 is you're going to formulate a question. So typically when you're out in the field, the more we work with people, the more questions arise. You want to know, is this intervention effective? Is this program that my organization just purchased, let's say a parenting program, is it effective and why? When I ran a domestic violence treatment program, I had the option to pick one of 2 kind of models of treatment. And so I did a ton of research about effectiveness. What did the research show? What did the clients feel? How effective was it in reducing recidivism? All of those different things. And then I made my decision based on that. But I had to look for it. I had to say, how effective is this program? We might also want to look at factors that affect outcomes. So if you're working in juvenile probation, maybe you want to know, what are the things that impact success or not success in juveniles when they're on probation? Or what factors are going to affect a mom coming into treatment who needs to go into recovery? What kind of things would benefit her? What things benefit moms who are struggling with methamphetamine use? So based on your population, based on what you're seeing, you're going to come up with a question. You might also want to know, what is the personal experience of individuals? We have individuals from all different places. Maybe you're working with refugees or people who've recently immigrated to America. You might want to know, what is their experience? Finally, you might want to know which assessment tools should be used. There are lots of great measurement tools and standardized tools out there. Some cost money, some don't. And so you might want to know, like, hey, I saw this really cool assessment tool. It's free. Is it effective? And the cool thing is there's almost always research about the effectiveness of a lot of these tools. So lots of different questions that you can focus on. Typically, they're more detailed than my kind of generic question of, does CBT reduce PTSD symptoms? Normally, you're going to have a little bit more discussion or description in your question. In who? Are you looking at veterans? Are you looking at children? Are you looking at first responders? When you talk about CBT, do you mean the full cognitive behavioral therapy with the homework and the structure and the stages? You have to really start to focus in. And we'll talk about that in the next few chapters as well, that in research, it's the same way. You might start vague, but ultimately when we're formulating a good question, we're really starting to narrow it down. What are we really looking for? The other thing to help you narrow that down is the CIAO model. So what you're thinking of is when you've got this kind of vague question, you want to start to narrow it down. So here's an example of how we could narrow this down. And again, this will apply to your literature review as well. You'll have a problem, you'll come up with a question. And so typically, like I said, it's more detailed than does CBT reduce PTSD symptoms. In this case, using that model, client characteristics, we could say female survivors of domestic violence with PTSD. The intervention could be CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Alternative intervention could be EMDR, and the outcome could be reducing PTSD symptoms. So the way we might reword that is CBT a more effective intervention than EMDR in reducing PTSD symptoms among female survivors of domestic violence? So we start broad and we start to bring it in. Or the other thing that you could say is, how effective is CBT in reducing PTSD symptoms among female survivors of domestic violence? In that case, the alternative intervention is nothing. Maybe you're just saying, hey, does CBT work compared to no treatment? So sometimes the alternative intervention is just the lack of an intervention as well. You may not be comparing two modalities. You may be saying, is it more effective for them to participate in treatment than not at all? So once you have come up with this good question, you're going to start to search for evidence. You can use the library database. You may not have access to that as a practitioner in the field, but you can always use Google Scholar, which I love. It's a great research tool. You can do things like Boolean search terms. I'm not going to go into detail, but it's something you can Google. And basically, it's a way for you to search library and Google Scholar databases by putting in words and then connecting them. So with and, I might say CBT and domestic violence and female. Because if I just type in CBT, I'm going to get 1,000 hits. But by saying and, you're saying I want articles that have CBT and specifically domestic violence and specifically females. So it really helps you start to narrow down those research articles, which will be really helpful when you're working on your literature review. Also, when you type in CBT, you're going to get a lot of research about other groups like veterans or males or children. And in this example, we're really just looking at domestic violence and females. So what you might do is you could say CBT not veterans, which tells your search engine that if you're looking for articles for CBT, they don't want one that looks at CBT and veterans or males or children. So you can use and not is a really nice way to start to narrow it down. So don't feel overwhelmed when you start doing your research. So the book references 3 ways to research. One is bottom-up searches, which is where you look very broadly, like the example that I used, and you start to narrow it down. You look at different search terms. You go, ooh, female survivors of domestic violence, but I want to look at one specifically with PTSD. Ooh, I specifically want to look at domestic violence survivors who went to a shelter afterwards. So you can start broadly and start to narrow in. They also have top-down searches, which is where you start with someone else's search or their research and then go from there. I wrote a paper in my program talking about the effects of yoga on PTSD symptoms in men who were incarcerated. And so I found a really good overview article that had looked at basically all the major research articles in the last 10 years. That gave me a great starting point, and then I could start to dig a little bit deeper by clicking like, oh, look at all the people they cited. Ooh, I'm going to look at that one and that one and that one. So top-down searches is you start maybe with something like the Campbell or the Cochrane review, you start with a meta-analysis or a system review, and then you start to expand out from there. And then finally, there's systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and these are a great starting point as well. Step 3, you're going to critically appraise the studies. So again, research knowledge is helpful. We'll talk more about this through the rest of the semester. And Rubin and Babbie provide some really great criteria for analyzing studies in the textbook as well. Once you've critically appraised those studies, you can say, okay, which intervention is most appropriate? Let's say I'm looking at CBT and its effectiveness in women who have had domestic violence. Well, I can look at that now and say, okay, the research shows that CBT is actually pretty effective for it. Great, now I can use it. Or you might say, ooh, CBT is not ideal, but they're saying EMDR is amazing. I wonder if there's a person in my agency who has EMDR training that can provide that based on the research. So you're really going to pick an intervention based on that. You're going to apply the chosen intervention. You might get trained in it. You might staff it with peers. You might have a guide that you've printed out that you follow. There's a lot of great books that show you how to do interventions as well. Step 6, you really want to provide some sort of evaluation, especially if you're using a new program. When I started my domestic violence treatment program, they had an existing program. They had never done any sort of evaluation. They didn't do an exit survey. They didn't ask the individuals in the program if they liked the material, if it was helpful in any way. So what I did when I stepped in is I took it over and I created an evaluation form that all of my graduates filled out anonymously and gave good feedback about the program, and it was so helpful. Sometimes you're looking at things like fidelity versus outcome. Fidelity measurements is when you're measuring how close did someone adhere to the intervention. If I'm doing DBT and they've got 25 sessions, fidelity measurement might say, hey, did Dr. Cobb do each session as close to the book, as close to the guide as possible, or did she deviate? Outcome measurements is, was the book helpful? Was the curriculum helpful? Did the participants at the end say it was beneficial? They learned something, their behavior changed. So different ways to evaluate. And you can do it quantitatively, which we'll talk about in a few chapters, through survey and assessment, or qualitatively, just through a client interview. They talk a lot about some of the myths and issues with implementing evidence-based practice. Let's say your organization's like, oh, we've got this great one. You've looked at the research, you've done all the steps. Sometimes those programs are really expensive. Trainings are expensive. It can be really, really hard to justify the cost if you have a vulnerable population that's struggling. It also takes time to implement evidence-based practices. If you get a new curriculum, it means training every single person there to make sure they're administering it the same. That takes time. I used to do training when I was a national consultant, and it was really hard for organizations to have all 15 of their clinicians in a training with me who's watching the patient. And so sometimes the time to get trained or the time to learn about a new practice and implement it is problematic. Sometimes you just get people that say, I have been doing this way for 20 years and I'm not going to change. And so that can be really challenging as well. Sometimes we have great evidence-based practices and they've only been tested on white undergraduate students. We haven't looked at them for minority groups or looking at them through different sexual orientations. So sometimes our EBPs really are applicable to a small percentage of who we actually see. So being aware of that is important. There's training limitations. Again, it's really difficult and expensive. Slow implementation. It takes a long time for an agency to integrate the new forms and integrate the new practices. And finally, misinterpretation. Sometimes there's just a resistance of, oh yeah, EBP, it's another buzzword, and people aren't real interested in adding it, which again is why it's so important for us to do as a process to make sure that we can not just share it with ourselves, but maybe our colleagues as well. So that was chapter 2. I hope this was helpful for you. Thanks.